Yes, are we recording? Yes, okay. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the AfghanEye podcast. My name is Sangar Paykhar and I'm your host. And together with me is my co-host, the founder of AfghanEye, Ahmed-Waleed Kakar. And we have a distinguished guest, a renowned Afghan journalist and author, Emran Feroz. Emran, welcome to the AfghanEye podcast.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for having me.
Okay, we are delighted to have you here on our very first show. And of course, my colleague Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, who is the founder of AfghanEye. Before we start with our interview, Ahmed-Waleed, would you please maybe briefly introduce AfghanEye to the people who are watching and hearing this podcast and they don't know what AfghanEye is and what it's all about, so please.
Sure, so thank you very much for the introduction, Sangar. So my name is Ahmed-Waleed Kakar and I'm the founder of AfghanEye. AfghanEye is a platform that I set up for Afghans in the Western world in general, as well as in the English-speaking Western world, to exchange ideas and platforms with one another. I set up AfghanEye about 3 weeks ago, and the main purpose behind it was to influence the discourse and narrative about Afghanistan independently of special interest groups and political entities and organizations. The discourse on Afghanistan, unfortunately, is dominated by people with political interests or representing political entities, and this has influenced policy making, which over the last 2 decades or so, we can agree could have been much better. So we set up AfghanEye independently, run by myself as well as my co-founder Sangar, in order to reclaim the narrative and tell the Afghan story, from an authentic perspective.
And speaking of authentic perspective, Emran Feroz is an Afghan journalist and he's writing for a lot of Western media in the English language and in German. Emran, again, thank you for being our guest. First of all, I would like to ask you, could you briefly tell us about how you enrolled into journalism and how did you become a journalist?
Yeah, again, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. I really appreciate seeing young Afghans aspiring and doing such work, challenging narratives. And I tried to do myself a couple of years ago. So I'm 28 years old now. I studied political science and philosophy in Germany. I was born and raised in Austria. And I started to do journalism. Or let's say I started to write articles and essays when I was 18 or 19 years old. The reason why I did this was obviously I wasn't satisfied with different media perspectives and narratives, not just on Afghanistan, but also on topics like Islam in Europe, Muslim identity, migration, refugees, all this stuff that affects all of us somehow. So it was in my early 20s when I think I was 21 years old when I started to do more professional journalism and to write for some magazines about Afghanistan particularly. But it was in 2013, 2014 when I decided to do this much more seriously, which meant to go to Afghanistan and to report from there. One crucial event was the presidential election in 2014, which I covered for different news outlets from Germany to Austria to the US. And since then, I'm regularly traveling to Afghanistan for reporting trips, doing research, and I'm still freelancing. And fortunately, it went quite well. I published a book in 2017 about the US drone warfare all around the world, but especially in Afghanistan. And, the topic of drone warfare is also connected to Germany because We have many U.S. military bases here in Germany, and without them, the whole drone war would not work. So I'm always trying to make a bridge, and I always try to paint a bigger picture. So because everything is connected, and so I'm trying to do this, and that's my work.
Yeah, I think your work is very appreciated, especially among Afghans. First of all, I've been following your work for years now. I think the first time I read an article authored by you was in 2014, and I've been following you ever since. And what I noticed that most of your work is critical of war on terror, which is a very important topic. Could you maybe tell us more about your personal background? Like you are from Afghanistan, you're an Afghan. Can you tell us about how you grew up and what's your background like?
Of course. So my father came to Europe it was more than 40 years ago when my father came to Europe. It was when Daoud Khan was in power and before the coup of the communists. So my grandfather, late Mohammad Mohsen Feroz, he was also a writer and a journalist, and back then he was also the editor-in-chief of Anis, which is a weekly magazine, which used to be a weekly magazine in Afghanistan, in Kabul especially, very well read among urban elites and the middle class and all these people back then. And he always wanted his sons to study abroad, so he sent my father to Europe, particularly first to Germany and then later to Austria, because my father graduated from a German-speaking school in Kabul.
Was it Lycée Amani?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because in Kabul, in Lycée Amani, their foreign language was German.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so my father was able to speak German before he arrived to Europe.
Okay.
And he did that. And then he was he was forced to stay there after the coup and all the war started. And regarding my mother's family, my mother is also from a family which has a political background. My late grandfather, Abdul Hakim Mujda, was a political activist and poet, and later he joined the Mujahideen. And one of his sons, Wahid Mujda, my uncle, was a well-known political analyst and writer. He was killed last November in Kabul. And so I think many people, especially in Afghanistan or Afghanistan-related people, know him. So yeah, I have this kind of political background, but so my family has this kind of political background. On the one side, they were very close to the Mujahideen, and on the other side, my paternal grandfather was one of these urban elitists. I would say he was kind of, left-wing nationalist, progressive, whatever, and difficult to define this. But we as children in Europe, in Austria, we did not grow up with these particular political views. Because, the thing is that many Afghans who grew up in the diaspora are taking over the political beliefs of their parents, if the parents used to be politically active. And in my case, there were family members who were politically active, but my parents were not. And actually, all the history of Afghanistan and all these things, what happened during the last 40 years, 50 years, I didn't learn most of it from my parents because, I just educated myself because they were in a sense, they were Muslim, but also very, in a way, liberal in things like, educate yourself and find out what is your path. And I think this was also quite a good thing.
Yes. And could you maybe explain how not being influenced by your parents politically has shaped your work as a journalist? Because I think it's also necessary to mention this. Unfortunately, in the last 40 years, everything has become politicized in Afghanistan. So we often see Afghans who are involved in the public life as journalists, activists, or politicians. They are always a reproduction of the same ideas and beliefs of their parents, and maybe it's also relevant to discuss this. Could you say that not being politically shaped by your parents, that affect your work as a journalist?
Yes, I think it affected my work because, obviously I try to distance myself from everything and try to be, I don't believe in being objective. I don't think that any journalist out there isn't biased. But I was shaped by other things. I wasn't shaped by my parents. For example, you mentioned the war on terror. When the war on terror started, when the Americans attacked Afghanistan and when 9/11 took place, I was 9 years old. I was 9 years old, and I noticed that the whole environment around me was changing. And for example, in school, people started to talk about American airstrikes, Osama bin Laden, and you have to keep in mind that Austria is a very homogeneous society, especially back then. So you suddenly had all these Austrian kids asking me, "Hey, what's going on in Afghanistan?" And for example, I remember the first day after 9/11, when I was in school, my school teacher asked me, so we heard something about Afghanistan and that the culprits are sitting in Afghanistan. And then she turned to me and looked at me and said, "Okay, Emran, your family is from Afghanistan. Maybe you know why these people did this."
So you were 9 years old and your teacher asked you to explain this.
Yeah. I think this was one of the most crucial events ever, and shaped me a lot. And because I started to understand that I can't get away from this topic. People keep talking, people keep asking me about it. People make fun about me, saying things like, "Hey, is Osama bin Laden your uncle? And are you related to the Taliban?"
I'm glad it wasn't only me.
I had a similar experience.
Yeah, but the thing is, back then, especially back then in our hometown in Austria, there were no other Afghans. I was always the total exception. There were people with Turkish backgrounds, people with, from Yugoslavia, from ex-Yugoslavia, Serbia, Croatia, and all these countries. Many of these people are living in Austria. There were many of them, but there was always just one Afghan, and that was me. And I didn't know what was going to start in Afghanistan, but people were celebrating it like, you deserve what is going to come. You deserve the bombs because you did this in New York. And I didn't know anything, but I was like, I really, I was feared, and I really felt afraid of what is happening in my home country, although I didn't know anything about it. And I think these things really shaped me a lot.
Yeah, I think both of us can relate to you because around 2001, I can remember I graduated from high school and then I was in college for a few years. And I remember shortly after 9/11 in college, one of our teachers, he said that today we have to discuss what happened because it's a significant event. And there was this girl, blonde Dutch girl, sitting in front of me, and she said, "I hope they drop an atomic bomb on Afghanistan and destroy the whole country and kill everybody. And I was sitting behind her. I was back then, I think, 18 years old or something. So I told her, do you know I am from Afghanistan? I have relatives there. So you wish to have my whole family, all of my relatives, you wish to see them all killed? And she paused and she said, well, yeah, but they did this to Americans. So, you know, and I was really upset. And I think for me personally, it was quite a shocking experience because I spent first part of my life in Afghanistan, and I was a teenager when I moved to Europe. So I could clearly remember Afghanistan and how Afghanistan was like and what the people are like. I had still a lot of relatives and family there. And these experiences, I think they have lasting impact on our identity, on our beliefs, on how we view the world. And something similar, we were discussing this earlier with Ahmed-Waleed, is that did you, Ahmed-Waleed, did you actually decide to study politics and history because of Afghanistan's current events?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, firstly, I'd say that my experience probably wasn't as horrifying as yours and Imran's. I was
because you're from Londonistan, yeah.
I'm from London. No, I was about 5 or 6 when 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
And I remember walking into my living room, and obviously the Twin Towers were falling down. I went into school a couple of days later, and everyone was like, "Oh, like, who's Osama bin Laden?" Like, the kids were not judging me for it; they were excited. Like, who is this guy? And I was like, "I don't know. You tell me who is."
Typical for London.
I came to school a couple of days later, and I was like, "Bro, he's not even Afghan. Why are you asking me?" But
yeah, I did the same. I informed myself, who is this guy? Okay, he's not even Afghan.
Not a single Afghan was involved in 9/11. Not a single Afghan was involved.
And then when I used to take these things a little seriously. So when I was about 12 and 13, and in class someone would say, "Oh, bin Laden's my uncle," like, I would give a very factual response and say, "Actually, he's not even from Afghanistan." But
I used to learn that.
Yeah.
I answered like that.
Yeah, I learned the hard way that no one really cared. But I think because of that, because of 9/11 and the war that's been going on in Afghanistan ever since, I was always a news junkie. I always wanted to make sense of what was going on. We got my first laptop in my house. It was my mother's laptop by name, but I was on it day and night, just reading Afghanistan on Wikipedia. All of the things that didn't make sense to me, which was about 80% of it, I read it and reread it. And it got to the stage where my parents would tell me, "You know what, focus on your actual studies in school, focus on your academic studies." We fast forward to when I'm 18 and 19 and picking what courses I want to do at university. Whilst amongst Afghans, the social sciences and humanities route is not as desirable as, let's say, science and engineering and maths, I decided way before then that this is the sort of course that I want my academic life to take. I want to really get to grips with and understand not just Afghanistan, but of course Afghanistan within how politics and international relations play out globally. So, yeah, I mean, I think everyone can agree that 9/11 and what's been going on since then has played a massive part in everyone's.
You know what's the crazy thing? Because we now mentioned bin Laden so much. There's still people who think that Osama bin Laden is from Afghanistan.
Yeah, and not only that, but I think that it is also quite common for people who are very involved with Middle East and Muslims to still have very distorted ideas. Like last night I was watching this famous American blogger and vlogger. This woman, she is very active commenting on news and politics and everything that's going on and entertainment. So I was just watching her. She was discussing Corona, and she said during her live stream, she said that her entire staff, people who run her website, who do all the graphic design and hosting, all these things, they're Pakistani. Yeah. So she was actually explaining how she is involved with people from other parts of the world. And then she said, yes, and I was talking to these guys in Pakistan, and I was hearing people in the background speaking in Arabic, and people were commenting in her live chat like they don't speak Arabic in Pakistan, and she was like, yeah, whatever. Whatever. So you see, there is a kind of arrogance and disregard for people in those areas, and you know that this is why I think it's very important to have journalists from Afghanistan or people who have an Afghan background, who can understand Dari, Pashto, people who can easily travel around Afghanistan and talk to people and relate to people. These are the people who need to be telling our stories. They are the ones who need to tell the world about what's going on in Afghanistan and what's happening there. And this is why I think it's so valuable and important to have Afghan journalists. And speaking of that, Imran, could you explain when you started traveling in Afghanistan, when you started writing, did you face any challenges? Like, was your work made impossible for you in any way, or how was your experience?
You mean regarding my work if someone in Afghanistan made it difficult for me to work?
No, just generally. Was that the case?
To be honest, no. I mean, I have made pretty good experiences because the people here, as you said, the thing is that many people here, white editors from Germany or from Austria, they themselves appreciate if there is someone who has this specific background and can do the work, if there is someone. And I tried to sell myself in the best way to fill this niche, and I did this successfully, I think. So I have many reading sessions and all that stuff, and traveling around in Austria or in Germany, meeting different people, and there are always a lot of people, especially these older generation of left-wing people, who are like, media is lying, and they're all lying, and I bet it's so difficult for you. So it is difficult sometimes, but it's not that it's not the fake media that isn't allowing you to publish your stuff or something like that, or they are not censoring you. I have never been censored. I've been censored one time, and this was actually by a left-wing media outlet in Germany. Because they didn't like my opinion on Syria. So, it was about, I think it was about, Afghan militias who are fighting for Iran in Syria. I've written also about that in the past, and I'm still observing this topic. And they didn't like to hear it. They didn't like to see that the Iranian regime is actually exploiting Afghan refugees, sending them to Syria. For them, it's Syria, the anti-imperialist Bashar al-Assad, who is fighting Zionist Wahhabi jihadists.
A lot of leftists and progressives here in the West have still similar ideas about Afghanistan. If we discuss the communist revolution in Afghanistan, the era of Soviet occupation, the regime of Khalqis, Parchamis, all of these topics, there are many leftists here in the West who will defend them and glorify them and portray them as enlightened and progressive and these have you experienced any kind of backlash
regarding I had some backlash regarding that too. For example, as you said, I'm writing a lot about the war on terror, about American war crimes in Afghanistan, all that. When I do that, especially these left-wing folks, they like it. They're celebrating it, and they really like it. Okay, I'm fine with that. But when I started to, for example, when there was some anniversary of the Saudi Revolution or anything related to that, the withdrawal of the Soviet troops and all that, when I'm writing about that, and I do write about that too, I'm saying, hey, okay, 1979 to 1989, 10 years Soviet occupation, around 2 million Afghans have been killed, and all the people who fought the Red Army and its allies in Kabul were not CIA proxies brainwashed by the ISI in Pakistan. They had a reason to fight. And when they faced some kind of radicalization, it was obviously that people radicalized because people nowadays in Afghanistan, if they're getting bombed by American drones, they're becoming they're radicalized. Obviously, there is a backlash, and back then it was quite similar. If Soviet helicopters just killed hundreds of people in the village, the relatives, of course, were like, okay, we're going to fight these people. And if you say that, it's fine. I mean, I'm getting published, but for example, I had one editor. It was also a German editor for German weekly, and she was like, no, I'm not publishing this. But she didn't give me a reason. The thing was, she was the chief editor, and the other editor, my editor, he liked the piece, and he commissioned it. And when I sent it to him, he was like, yeah, that's great, we're going to publish this. And then 4 days later, he reached me out, hey, we have some problem. My editor-in-chief, she's going crazy. I don't know what's up with her. And then I asked her, and she was like, no, it's too one-sided, something like that. And there are other outlets, similar outlets, they publish it, but when I take a look at the comments, the comment section, you see a lot of these left-wing people saying, hey, what kind of propaganda is this? It's jihadi propaganda, because obviously the communist regime in Afghanistan was very progressive, and it was liberating its people, but it was kicked out thanks to the Americans and its Salafi jihadi allies. So yeah, they're always like that. And you become really, really tired always explaining that to people. But yeah, that's, for example, something I didn't notice that back then that clear as I do it today.
Yes. And what did you say when people were obviously showing disagreement, like for instance on Twitter? Did you receive a lot of backlash from German progressives and leftists on social media?
To be honest, it went back because I don't know why, but it went back. Maybe because I'm not so much writing anymore about this Syria-related topic, which is linked to Afghanistan, the Iran connection to the Afghan militias. There was a time when I did this a lot, and maybe it's linked to that, but I'm open for discussions, but I think on social media, there are some problems discussing with people. First of all, I'm not feeding trolls. I'm not feeding trolls. So I don't discuss with them. I also don't like if people use, bad language or that stuff, even if they're not trolls. And then there's always a group of people who pretends to be interested in a discussion. And back then, a few years ago, I was always polite and tried to debate with these people or give them some feedback or whatever when I had the possibility and the time to do this. But I noticed, I just don't do this anymore because I also don't have the time for it.
Speaking of backlash, you had some experience of some controversy recently on Twitter. I think it was about a tweet where Dr. Abdullah, one of the presidents of Afghanistan, was mentioned. He said something about the Durand Line, and then I saw like hundreds of people responding to your tweet. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, Abdullah called the Durand Line a border, and a lot of people attacked him for that, especially a lot of Pashtun nationalists attacked him. People from Afghanistan attacked him for saying that it's a border. And I was just like, I retweeted what he said and was like, okay, so you're angry now because he called the Durand Line a border. But why do you guys never mention that all the other, all borders of Afghanistan have been drawn by the colonialists? Of course, the Durand Line has a specific history and it's tied to many things. But at the end of the day, why do you guys never mention all the other borders? Why don't you do that? Maybe because it's, the Durand Line topic is linked to very selective discourse.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And what's also quite interesting about this Durand Line issue is that when the criticism comes from supporters of Ashraf Ghani, they often forget that it was during Ashraf Ghani's reign in the last 5 years when Imran Khan came to Torkham and they created that new port, and Miakhil, who is the governor of Nangarhar.
Exactly, the governor of Nangarhar, Miakhil also joined that, and it was a very official ceremony.
Yeah.
I reject the Durand Line personally. I reject all lines that have been drawn by colonialists, just to make this clear. But the thing is that the government of Ashraf Ghani just pretends to be nationalist or patriotic or whatever, and that it is interested in this issue. But it's just exploiting it for obvious reasons.
And it's also actually related to another of your recent controversies, and that was with I think during one of the inaugurations few weeks ago, there were guys from Pashtun Tahaffuz movement who visited Kabul, and one of them, I think he visited I don't know what was it. Is it a shrine or something for Nur Muhammad Taraki? Can you please explain?
Officially, it's the house of Taraki. He visited the house of Taraki, and as you said, so first of all, maybe for the viewers, so we had two inauguration ceremonies in Kabul for two people who claim to be president. Now the supporters of Ashraf Ghani, because the supporters of Ashraf Ghani say no, there's one president. It's just Gul Marjan Abdullah who is crazy in doing that. But no, for 99% of the rest of the world, it seemed like Afghanistan is having two inauguration ceremonies, and these two men claim to be presidents. And on Ashraf Ghani's inauguration ceremony, we had people, as you said, from the PTM movement, from Pakistan, or from the Pashtun areas in Pakistan, and one of these guys was Abdullah Nangyal, who is known in these circles, but it's not someone people need to know about, I think. But he was there, and he visited the house of Nur Muhammad Taraki, the first communist dictator of Afghanistan after the so-called revolution in 1978. And as you said, it also looked like a shrine, so you had this picture big there, and it was kind of weird, and obviously there were many There were many former communists from the Khalq fraction who joined him. I think at least some of them have been identified. And this was a really disgusting event in my eyes, because Taraki killed a lot of Afghans. He was a butcher. He was a maniac. He was even too radical and extremist for the people in Moscow back then. And when the Soviet ambassador in Kabul once faced Taraki and tried to convince him of, hey guy, don't kill so many people, that because you might face the backlash, he answered and said, what's your problem? I'm just doing what Lenin preached. So wipe out everyone who was standing against the revolution. And he killed a lot of people who were, zero politically active, just average Afghans, people who prayed 5 times a day. They were radicals for him.
This is also related to what you mentioned earlier about progressives here in the West, is that there are also a lot of Afghans who would, until up at this day, they will still defend Nur Muhammad Taraki and what he did, especially like recently there was I think it was 42 years after the Herat massacre. And there were a lot of people on social media, on Facebook and on Twitter, and they were saying, look, the Herat massacre was necessary. And they said that it was necessary to do that. So apparently, after 40 years of war, after millions of Afghans have died, there are still a lot of people in our society who would just plainly defend huge atrocities. And I think this is also a huge challenge for Afghans to accept the fact that you can't proceed and desire peace and stability in Afghanistan while you are defending any of the parties involved who has blood on his hands. Like, for instance, when we were discussing this earlier about your background, suppose you would come into journalism and you would start writing about Afghanistan, but at the same time you would be defending some faction, like your parents' political faction, in your work as a journalist. That would seriously affect your work, but it also creates an environment where intellectuals, journalists, academics, they no longer operate as independent people, but as partisans. And this is what I also observe, unfortunately, in the Afghan media, because in the last 18, 19 years, we had so much development. There are so many new media outlets. We have TV stations, so many websites, Facebook pages. And while there is a extreme exponential growth in the Afghan media, I think that there is still a huge problem because it's so partisan, and the messaging and the narrative is very divisive. And I think that as Afghans we have a responsibility to address this, because sure, we all have our own biases. I'm an individual, I'm a human being, I have my own views and biases, but when we enter the public sphere and when we discuss these issues on a platform, on a public platform, we have to bear in mind that the whole world is not just based on our own biased vision of what's happening or what happens, or we can't just proceed by defending certain people, certain politicians or certain figures and expect others to treat us with respect or value our opinion. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I think you hit a very good point with regard to the contemporary Afghan media. So, I mean, obviously, a spectator or anyone observing can see that Afghan media, it's flourished. One could say flourishing, but at the same time, you have very, prominent TV stations running ads for the recruitment to the Afghan National Army. Now, if the country is in a state of war, right, and you're advertising recruitment for one of the parties to the conflict, then you can't really claim to be neutral or unbalanced or be providing an equal platform to everyone. You see it in the airtime that's given to certain individuals who may or may not be influential on social media. But and this is one thing that I think many observers are missing, is that someone that's influential in social media in Afghanistan is not the same as someone being influential on social media in London, simply because the levels of illiteracy, or even if there is literacy, people with internet, and then you're assuming that Twitter, they're tech savvy enough to be able to use Twitter and hashtags. So someone with 10, 20 or 50,000 followers, even with a blue tick next to their name, being given undue amounts of airtime, is not really, doesn't reflect very well on the organization, because quite frankly, it's not representative of any sort of real Afghan living in, let's say, in the rural part of the country, whose concerns and needs, whose grievances are much more primitive in quote marks, or just, bread and butter issues. So I think you had a very good point with that, with regard to the Afghan media of today.
Yeah, Imran, when you face backlash on social media after issuing your own, sharing your own views and opinions, does that also affect the way people perceive you as a journalist? Would you characterize that as such?
Yes, the thing is, so first of all, you mentioned a lot of important points. The problem we have is that the inner Afghan debate, it's always, there's always a categorization that is taking place. If you criticize NATO war crimes, the war on terror, a lot of Afghans would say, okay, this guy is pro-Taliban. If you do the opposite, they say, okay, he's pro-NATO and he's a Western propagandist, something like that. And this goes on. This is also with all the media outlets there. There's different media outlets, and if you ask people about them, they would say, this one belongs to Iran, this one belongs to Pakistan, that one is, when it comes to ethnicity, they would say, this one is more, it belongs to Pashtuns, this one belongs to Tajiks, this one belongs to Hazara, and it goes on like that.
But isn't that the case? Isn't that the case? Aren't all those media outlets somehow representing a specific?
Yes, that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, because they created a landscape that is actually, at the first sight it looks very diverse, but at second you see that it's actually also dividing a lot. And
yes,
it's. I don't see a lot of healthy debates on these channels. I am always also wondering what kind of the scheme of how debates are taking place there is also pretty weird, because you have talks and then they invite 2 or 3 guests, and then all of everyone is talking, but they are not debating. Everyone is saying his or her opinion, and it's kind of weird, because it's different here. For example, in the Western world, if you take a look at news channels, these debates, for example, in Germany and Austria, often they're also very problematic and very polarizing, especially when it comes to all these Islam and Muslim topics, etc. But at least you can see that people are just debating with each other. But in Afghan media, it's very weird, I think. And
when there is a real debate, sometimes they get violent.
Exactly. When there is a real debate, they are starting to attack each other, and they start to physically harm each other, and then that's the next point. Social media, Afghan social media is crap. I think it's not even just crap. It's dangerous what is taking place there, because
I agree.
Yeah, all the people, Afghans in Afghanistan, Afghans in diaspora, refugees, everyone is having a smartphone, and they are just turning their webcam on and starting political debates but in a very toxic way, in a very, very toxic, attacking other ethnicities, attacking other sects, and just slurs, and it's terrible. And this took place for the last 10 years, 15 years at least. And the result of that is that if you try to be objective as possible, as neutral as possible, people don't understand it. They are like, hey, what's wrong with this guy?
They expect you to be extremely biased. They expect you to be extremely partisan.
If you're not like that, they're like, hey, this is an opportunist or a shapeshifter or just stupid and weird.
You just don't make sense to them because they can't put you in a box in their head. So you just don't make sense to them, which makes them either fear you or hate you. But because it's just the idea of principled politics has been so eroded over the last 4 decades, and there's been so much backstabbing and double crossing and inconsistencies and U-turns and everything, that the idea of someone just sitting, observing, and deducing what is right, what is wrong, objectively, is anathema to a lot of people. And with regard to I'm really glad you mentioned the thing about the Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara sort of news channels, right? I think one of the problems we have after the post-2001 model, let's say, is this sort of understanding, or everyone's agreed in broad terms that the political system needs to be inclusive, right? Now, what inclusive means is anyone's guess, because there's somewhat this understanding where there has to be a certain amount allocated for the Hazaras and the Tajiks and the Pashtuns. So, for example, when we have a president, one of the vice presidents has to be from this ethnic group and one from the other ethnic group. And it sounds good in theory, but what it's actually done, what we can observe, is it's fed factionalism in Afghanistan. And I wouldn't say Afghanistan is unique in this. For example,
Iraq.
In Lebanon,
we have the same in Lebanon.
Confessionalism, where a Sunni and a Shia and a Druze, and it's led to such polarizing and corrupt. It's enabled corruption that they've been protesting for months now. The same thing in Iraq as well. So I think we really need to ask ourselves: yes, do we want an inclusive system? Yes. Could we do it better? I mean, personally, I would say absolutely 100%.
Of course, I think so too. Yeah. It's because, foreign powers who had their imaginations being fulfilled in these places. And for that reason, it's also always important to connect the dots. For example, I know also a lot of Afghanistan journalists who just, they're focusing on Afghanistan, but they don't know what's going on in the region. They can't connect the dots. They're just...
Speaking of this issue, if I may, the issue of Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which is a movement that is fighting for basic civil rights of Pashtuns in Pakistan. This particular movement is becoming more and more controversial in a very actually unexpected way, because first of all they emerge as a movement in Pashtunkhwa because Pashtuns felt like they were being systematically oppressed by the state, especially the Pakistani security apparatus, and they were the war and terror was affecting them the most in Pakistan. But now when you see like some of their prominent figures coming to Afghanistan, participating in these political events, this has its effects on Pashtun Tahaffuz movement and their plight in Pakistan. And we as Afghans, while we claim that we have same culture, same language, same value, and same ties of kinships with Pashtuns on the other side of the border, somehow I feel like people are being negligent to how negative this kind of political posturing with PTM, how negative it is for them and their plight in Pakistan. How would you comment on that?
Yes. So the thing with PTM is, as you mentioned, during the inauguration of Ashraf Ghani, we had several leaders of them in Kabul. I think the most important ones were not people like Abdullah Nangyal, but especially two of them, Mohsen Dawar and Ali Wazir. And these people also spent some days in Afghanistan. They had a lot of interviews. They faced a lot of attention, and at the same time, it appeared very clear to me, at least, that the Afghan president is now portraying himself again
as a Pashtun nationalist.
As a Pashtun nationalist who is exploiting this issue. It started we should not forget that Ashraf Ghani postponed his inauguration some minutes or hours just to let these people arrive. And then they arrived via military aircraft, Afghan military aircraft, at least Mohsen Dawar and Ali Wazir, because they had some problems to enter Afghanistan first. And then Imran Khan, Pakistan's prime minister, intervened and allowed them to enter to leave Pakistan, as far as I know, as far as I've followed this topic. And then they arrived, and then they took this aircraft, I think, from Jalalabad, and I think they drove from Turkhan to Jalalabad, and then in Jalalabad they took this aircraft and went directly to Kabul. And so we had this, and then we had all these interviews with them, and they faced a lot of media attention, and it was a big thing for the Pashtun nationalists in Afghanistan. But the thing is, it was a big thing for them, but there are many other Afghans who don't care about Mohsen Dawar or Ali Wazir or PTM. I think it's obvious. I mean, why should someone in Badakhshan or Panjshir care about Larobar or something like that? They have, other problems. And also a lot of people in Kabul don't know really much about them. It's just this specific circle that is celebrating them. And if you question what is going on, things, for example, what Sangar just did, for example, if they appear like that in Kabul, they're maybe actually damaging themselves and the whole cause in Pakistan, because the Pakistani establishment would just say, hey, what do you want? Do you want equal rights as a Pakistani citizen, or do you want to behave as a proxy for foreign governments and foreign intelligence services? Because Mohsen Dawar faced Amrullah Saleh, and he was very proud of talking about him. So Amrullah Saleh is now vice president of Afghanistan, so Ashraf Ghani is vice president. He used to be the boss of NDS. He's using a very, very strong anti-Pakistan rhetoric on Twitter and everywhere where he appears. And also, the whole appearance and the whole trip itself was kind of a propaganda trip for Afghan Pashtun nationalists. And to be honest, if I was someone who stands up against them, part of the Pakistani establishment, I would say the same, because they make it easy for me to criticize them and say, hey, you're foreign proxies. And I think as Sangar said, that PTM has a very important cause in these Pashtun areas in Pakistan, and there is a lot of terrible things that happen there, and a lot of injustice, and it's systematically. It's a huge problem that needs to be challenged. And first of all, I was very optimistic when I saw the rise of PTM, especially when I heard the speeches of Manzoor Pashtun, who was not in Kabul. I think this was not a coincidence that he was not in Kabul.
Would you say that Manzoor Pashtun and Ali Wazir and Mohsin Dawar, even though they're all part of leadership of PTM, that there is some difference in their approach, in their activism, and their maybe their ideas and beliefs?
I think that the whole movement is not homogeneous, and also the leadership doesn't appear to be homogeneous. For example, I also know many Pashtuns in Pakistan. Actually, I have a lot of relatives who are living in Pakistan, born and raised there. A lot of them are also Pakistani citizens, relatives of my grandmother. It's not important, but because people on Twitter, if you criticize certain things, then they appear like, hey, especially these nationalists.
Yeah.
If they try to silence you, they try to slur you, and they say things like, hey, you're not connected to this issue, you're not allowed to talk about this. Why I'm not allowed to talk about it? I'm allowed to talk about everything I want, and I'm also linked to this. I have also relatives on the other side of the Durand line, and so I think that a lot of people over there also, for Pashtuns in Pakistan, what is really important for them, and a lot of them do, that's what I have experienced a lot. Contrary to the nationalists in Afghanistan, they first say our Muslim identity, and then they talk about ethnicity.
Yeah.
In Afghanistan, it's kind of vice versa. They're like, often it's nationalism above everything. And for PTM, it was also important to have a guy like Manzoor Pashtun, who is, praying 5 times a day and wears a beard, and who is a Muslim, practicing Muslim, if you like this word, to use it. And also in terms of his rhetoric, he always said that we don't want foreign interference. We are not proxies of anyone. We are a grassroots movement. We have a very specific cause, and we don't want to let anyone hijacking this cause. But the Afghan president is hijacking this cause because he doesn't do anything that would be helpful for the people on the ground.
That's actually what I would ask both of you. Maybe you can explain to me, how does this political posturing with PTM and wearing those red hats, how does this actually help people in Pashtunkhwa? How are these politicians and these activists and these rhetoricians on social media, how are they actually helping those people? I'm curious. Do you guys know how?
Okay, so I think my answer would be they're not helping them. And I think that not only are they not helping them, but like Imran said, they're providing very easy ammunition. They're literally gifting ammunition to their detractors in Pakistan, in the Pakistani deep state and the apparatus, to tarnish them. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation is such that Pashtun political activism in Afghanistan very often gets characterized as a Pakistani conspiracy. We see this with the Taliban in more recent times, and Pashtun political activism in Pakistan gets characterized as an Afghan/Indian conspiracy. So when you had for example, the ANP, the Awami National Party in Afghanistan, established by Bacha Khan and, the older guys, and as a brand, it held some currency amongst the masses, but especially in the Soviet invasion and the US invasion, we know especially in Pashtunkhwa, there were a lot of, as well as in Pakistan in general, there were a lot of protests against Musharraf joining in the war on terror on Afghanistan. And the Awami National Party allying in the US war in Afghanistan very much discredited them. So I think it was with a lot of optimism and glee, in fact, that when PTM rose up from Waziristan, with a charismatic young leader like Imran noted, someone who prays, a son of the soil, if you will, charismatic, not tainted by political catastrophes like the ANP did, right? Not tarnished by any of that, having spent a lot of his life in refugee camps and whatever. I think it was very much a cause for optimism for Pashtuns in Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan, because obviously I know myself, I personally sympathize and I was optimistic. When Ashraf Ghani starts to get involved to gain points amongst nationalists in Afghanistan, it harms that cause. And when people like Mohsen Dawar come in, who's been very vocal in supporting drone strikes in Waziristan, those drone strikes in Waziristan was essentially left at the mercy of US drone strikes for many years, and that was done in collusion with the Pakistani military. Pakistani military turned a blind eye to that. So Mohsen Dawar coming out and saying, I'm so pro-Pashtun and I care so much about people's lives, after literal hundreds of tweets saying, yes, I'm, being the vociferous supporter of these airstrikes, really dampens the legitimacy of PTM and the platform he's been provided. Then you have someone like Amrullah Saleh, who's not a Pashtun, but that's not a problem, because you don't have to be a Pashtun to sympathize with the civil rights movement. But when you have someone like Amrullah Saleh with a track record of enacting security policies that really very much devastated many Pashtun communities in the south and the southeast, wearing a red hat and claiming the bandwagon of Pashtun nationalism in Pakistan, it further hurts the cause, especially when Amrullah Saleh, like Imran said, is on every platform pushing a very anti-Pakistan narrative. I think so. It's not helping the cause at all. Ashraf Ghani may in the short term gain some Larobar screams and cheers from the crowd, but in Pakistan itself, it's doing anything but helping the cause.
This same issue applies to the relationship Afghanistan and India has, especially with respect to what's going on in Pakistan. Like, for instance, we have a situation in India where most Muslims are up in arms about what the government is doing in India, and there is a huge problem at the moment in Kashmir where there is a lockdown and people are basically imprisoned there, just like the Palestinians are in Gaza. And while we see this happening, you have these Indian nationalists, these Hindu extremists who are cheering for Afghan government. They pretend like they care about Afghans, and Pakistanis, they're using this as some sort of evidence or proof to claim, Afghans are no good, their government is no good, so therefore, if PTM is celebrated and glorified by Afghan government, it means that PTM is part of some sort of Indian Hindu anti-Muslim conspiracy. So this is a problem that we also see in places like Syria and Turkey, Iran and Iraq. We have the Kurdish minorities in those countries who are facing systematic oppression for decades. And when you see like a very prominent, active and outspoken Zionist, Israeli or maybe some other Western Zionist cheering for the Kurds, it doesn't really help the Kurds. It doesn't help them. It further delegitimizes their struggle, their fight for their rights, because they say, well, look, you as a Kurd, whatever you say, the Zionist oppressors are defending you, so you must be no good.
Why else would the Zionists support you?
Yeah, so this is
You mentioned Kashmir. The thing is also, a lot of these Afghan nationalists pretend to be supporting human rights, but they are very selective. And if you talk with them about Kashmir, they say very, very absurd things. At least I have heard and read that. Things like, Kashmir is fine. Kashmir is fine. There are just some people, ISI proxies, who are doing that. And actually, the situation here is very well, as Afghan ambassador Tahir Qadri said a few weeks ago. he participated in a propaganda trip to Kashmir, and
he allowed himself to be used as a token, as a prop.
He really he also doesn't appear to be very intelligent and smart, to be honest, because he faced a lot of criticism, and recently regarding the corona crisis, he said to all Afghans, please don't take the plane if you return home. Everyone was like, okay, what should we take now? A spaceship? Or
how do you want to travel from India to Afghanistan? You should take the high-speed train from New Delhi to Kabul.
No. Okay, let's not become personal here, but regarding what he did in terms of Kashmir, he participated in a propaganda trip, and a lot of these Afghan politicians, government officials, they didn't say until today they don't say anything about, not just about Kashmir. Everyone on the world is literally criticizing what is happening in India. We have a fascist government there, and
literally a fascist.
It's literally a fascist, which is targeting Muslims, lynching Muslims, and then it's so problematic, I think, to see all these Afghans celebrate.
Speaking of fascism, I think one of the things I keep seeing happening right now in Afghanistan is that we have a government, at least we have two governments at the moment. We have Dr. Abdullah and we have Dr. Ashraf Ghani, both intellectuals, very educated men who have traveled around the world, and you would expect them and their followers to also believe in very advanced ideas and beliefs, but they don't. For instance, in Afghanistan, you still have to explain to people why nationalism is not a good thing, why nationalism as an ideology is very problematic. They don't really understand, and they say, nationalism means loving your country. So if nationalism, if loving your country is nationalism, so how can you say I'm nationalist and then defend some guy or some person or even a government that is killing his own people? The issue of nationalism, one of the things I experienced personally is I was debating an Afghan about this issue. I said, listen, if you really care about Afghanistan, you must and you should be critical of its government. I think it was a famous Western politician, or who was it? He said that patriotism is questioning your own government, something like that. I don't really remember, but if you truly care, if you truly care,
you don't see anything like you're being attacked and defamed as a traitor or as a spy.
Yes,
all these things. If you question the government and all institutions.
For instance, if you look at Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, these organizations, they are not created by the Pakistani ISI or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard or the CIA. These organizations, they criticize everybody. Yes. So when you quote Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or any other crisis group, and you say, well, the current Afghan government and the international coalition that's supporting it is responsible for the majority of civilian casualties. This is a statistic. This is a fact. And if you as an Afghan, if you bring this up and you use it as criticism against the government, they say, well, you're a sellout, you're not a nationalist. Yeah. And this means that despite being...
Pakistan.
Yes. Yeah.
I think the problem is that at the moment, especially, I'm noticing that especially since Ashraf Ghani took over, that we have a government that is becoming more and more authoritarian, and its followership is also kind of idolizing Ashraf Ghani in a way that I think is not healthy. Calling him Ghani Baba, like, yeah, I think that's very crude and weird, and it's very problematic. I mean, you are not allowed to question it. You're not allowed to question.
It's very cringe as well.
Yeah, it's the government. The government is speaking what George Orwell called newspeak, and you have to believe it. And everything it is saying is true. And when you question it, they are like, what is wrong with you? You're ISI or Taliban supporter or something like that. And regarding every topic, it's regarding human rights violations, civilian casualties. It's regarding numbers of the coronavirus. If the government says we have 20 dead people all over, for example, 20 infected people all over the country, then they believe it. They say, hey, the government, they said it. They trust this, the institution. And they are trusting it in a very, very problematic way, I think.
Yeah, and the thing that really concerns me is we have a society in Afghanistan where we have people with different ethnic backgrounds, different ethnicities, different languages. There are different tribes. We have different religious sects. We have different religions in Afghanistan, different regions. It's a country that could be by itself an entire continent. There are so many differences. So when you have a complex society like Afghanistan that did not experience industrialization, we still have a very high rate of illiteracy. We have huge problems, things that are already solved and cleared in countries in other parts of the world, in the developing world. We still face those problems. So when you have so many problems, and then you have politicians and you have activists, you have people in all sorts of positions of power who speak multiple languages. They have traveled around the world. They have degrees from Western universities, and they are in charge of Afghanistan's fate at the moment. You expect them to act in an according way, but what we see is they're very tribalistic, they're very factionalist, and this is also reflecting in the way we had this farce of inauguration. Two people claimed presidency on the same day in about 500 meters distance from one another. This situation is really concerning because I think you guys have have you saw the videos of what happened in Zabul? Like there were like 40 Afghan soldiers who were killed. And the whole nation is angered, and there are so many people who are responding with a lot of anger and frustration. So naturally, people feel like they are in a hopeless situation. And at this particular moment, you would expect some other type of leadership, some other type of moral leadership from the educated elite, from the intellectuals, but we don't. It's a very shallow narrative, very partisan, and very they're constantly using ethnicity and their brand as a way to rally support, but their work as leaders is not really benefiting people.
Yeah.
Yes. No, because Ahmed-Waleed mentioned something important much earlier about all these TV commercials for the Afghan National Army. You see them all around, and on Tolo News, Tolo TV, all these channels, all these Afghan channels. They're making a lot of propaganda for the Afghan security forces. So first of all, what happened in Zabul, the Taliban killed a lot of soldiers. I think nobody here rejects that this was terrible, that I haven't seen anyone except of some few Taliban propagandists calling it a good thing, because the Taliban signed a deal with the Americans in Qatar, and what we see is a continuation of the war. We still see attacks, we still see Afghans killing each other, and that's what nobody of us wanted. And so that's obviously very problematic. But what we see now is, this massacre happened. The soldiers have been killed. But we see people now who they want retaliation in form of more war crimes, more human rights violations, more massacres, just killing people. And actually they already did. There was an airstrike in Kunduz, killing 11 family members. All of them were civilians. And a lot of people are celebrating that, because they consider it as some kind of retaliation. And there are also a lot of, we already mentioned, social media and the toxic discourse that is taking place there regarding Afghanistan. And there are people on social media who are reaching a lot of, hundreds of thousands of people, and they say things that are not just problematic. I think they're even violating the law of the countries they're living in, demanding bloodshed, demanding an eye for an eye, and all these things. And that's very problematic, and we see this happening.
Yes. Imran, could you please maybe share your opinion about how the English language journalists in Afghanistan are telling the stories, like for instance what happened recently in the past few days? How would you characterize that compared to the way the Afghan, like the Pashtun and the Dari media is reporting? Do you see any discrepancies?
Of course. I mean, the English reporting about what happened is a description of the event, what happened. It's mostly what I've seen. It's without any emotions. It's without supporting one side. It's just a description of what happened, because a lot of journalists that are writing about Afghanistan, a lot of Afghans who are writing for English media outlets, know that the guidelines for the Washington Post, for the New York Times, and all these outlets, they are not like, you can't be extremely biased like many Afghans want to see it. That's not possible. This is not maybe if you write an opinion piece, but I haven't read any opinion pieces about what recently took place last days. So in the English language, we see mostly just a description of the events by all these journalists, also by Afghan journalists, as far as I have seen. In Dari and Pashto, you see very, very emotional statements. They are differing between them and the Taliban or the enemy. They're constantly talking about the enemy. The enemy has to be killed. The enemy has to be punished, and it's very, very populist. It's emotional. It's they are demanding actions from the government and all these things. And in my eyes, a lot of these journalists actually, they are not journalists. They are political activists and propagandists, and they're also, benefiting of all the conflict. They feel happy to see all the likes and shares sometimes, I believe.
Speaking of benefiting, would you guys agree if I say that the end of war means that for a lot of people, end of their careers? Because personally, if I look at Afghanistan's recent history, from 2001 onwards, we've seen people who have amassed enormous amounts of money they've become millionaires and billionaires. There are people who have built their entire career on this current model of endless and endless presence of foreign troops and endless involvement of Western countries. So would you say that would you agree if I say that some people actually don't want the war to end because they see that as a end line for their business model?
Yes, I would definitely say that. I mean, we spoke about AfghanEye earlier, right? And one of the problems being that sort of the narratives or the narrative around Afghanistan is shaped by people with their own vested interests. And it's these vested interests, pushing this narrative obviously for their own benefit. And, like you said, the model that exists or has existed for nearly 2 decades now of, just constant pumping of aid, with little to no accountability that goes missing, billions and billions of dollars, right? I think one of the clearest examples for me was when news broke of, the Taliban and the US negotiating directly in Qatar. Many Afghans, both without of Afghanistan, were absolutely jubilant. Any sort of specter of peace, a tangible specter of peace, most Afghans are incredibly optimistic about. But almost instantly, you saw campaigns online, sort of like, what are my red lines about peace? What will I accept and what will I not accept, pushed by quite influential people. And the question that should have been asked and should still be asked is, where were your red lines, for the past 18 years when there was a constant state of war and conflict? When certain vested interests were not at risk and not at stake, there wasn't. And this, like I said again, the whole social media influential and real life dichotomy that exists within Afghanistan is at play here. The average person's concerns and grievances are not being represented here at all. It's those with, cosmopolitan, internationalist, wealthy connected with.
Speaking of which, if I may, no. Ali Latifi, who is also a very talented Afghan journalist, he was being interviewed by some TV station, English language TV station. I think it was Deutsche Welle, and they asked him about this particular question, and he said that he was speaking about the Kabul bubble. That people in Kabul, they have different concerns and they have these shisha lounges and cafes, and they think that the war will affect them, and that these concerns aren't the concerns of the rural Afghans. And this was perceived as something really controversial. He was being attacked for saying this, but the truth is that, like, for instance, if we speak about women's issues, there are over 40,000 dead Afghan soldiers, during the reign of Ashraf Ghani. That's a statistic that Ashraf Ghani said himself. 40,000 dead soldiers, yes? Okay, these dead soldiers, most of them are young men who are either engaged or married. They have a wife, or they're a breadwinner for their family. Okay, so when these guys die, when they are killed, they leave a widow behind.
Yes.
They leave young children, small girls, and if you're from rural Afghanistan, which is the case for most of these soldiers, in rural Afghanistan you don't have schools, you don't have job opportunity for women, so these guys, they are the only breadwinners for their family. So if the war continues and more of these guys die, more widows will be left out without an income, without support, and more children will grow without a father. And these people who are mostly affected by war in rural Afghanistan, especially women, the effect of war can't be compared to what people experience in the cities. To be honest and fair, full disclosure, I am from the city. I am a typical guy from Kabul. Even though I'm originally from a village just outside the city, I lived most of my life in Mikrorayon. Yeah, I'm Mikrorayon C, Mikrorayon 3. You know, the place to be in the 80s. That was the place to be. It was like most people who were somebody. They used to live there. The president, Dr. Najibullah, before he became president, he used to live like 200 meters away from us in another flat. So I am an urbanite. My entire family, they are urbanites. They are from the city, and I acknowledge that what we think is important, what our concerns aren't the concerns of people who live 50 kilometers outside Kabul. This is a fact, you know. Less than 50. So if we
that's so problematic because you know, you can enjoy your cappuccino in Kabul Shodanao in the early morning, and then you drive 30 minutes, and then you're in a village, and for example, or you drive 40 minutes, 30 minutes. You know, it's not far from Kabul city and rural Kabul or other provinces like Wardak, which are facing war and destruction and poverty for years. And then you can visit these places within a day, within half a day. You can go there. I did this. I visited these places. I made my reporting. I made my interviews, and then I returned in the evening. And it's so absurd that you're back in the bubble again, drinking your cappuccino and thinking, like, what kind of sick world is that? That, you know, it's two different worlds within a day in the same country, in the same area, in the same region, or whatever you want to call it. And of course, that's a problem. And a lot of these urbanites in Kabul, especially from certain circles, they don't want to accept this because they don't leave that bubble. And if you challenge this and if you just mention it, they are like, they become emotional. They don't want to accept it. But they fail totally because if you go to these places, you will find nothing. You will literally find nothing. And billions of dollars have been invested into Afghanistan during the last 2 decades. But you find nothing there. And with nothing, I literally mean nothing. And then you see that there's, something went really, really wrong in this country.
Yeah, and what interests me is to find out what are the important concerns that need to be brought forward when eventually there is a negotiation between the government and the Taliban. Like, we are often hearing this, our achievements of the last 18 years. Sure, 18 years ago, we didn't have all these schools and universities and the media and all these healthcare facilities. There are so many things that have happened in the last 18 years, and we can agree that there are a lot of achievements. However, those developments and those benefits haven't reached all Afghans equally. There are a lot of people who are disadvantaged, and they see a village 4 or 5 kilometers away from them getting all sorts of funding and projects and money, and their village doesn't get anything. So you have a huge difference between one village and the other village. I was speaking to an Afghan researcher recently, and she was explaining this to me. She said she traveled all around Afghanistan, yeah? She traveled all around Afghanistan, and she went to all these villages, and she was conducting research, and she said the differences can be very extreme, even with a very short distance, something that you can see with your own eye. One village and the other village have huge differences, and if you have a society that is facing so many problems, if one village gets all the projects, all the money and all the support, and the other village doesn't, and you have a war, obviously for the Taliban it's very easy to go to that disadvantaged village and recruit people. Tell them, you know what, this government is only helping them, and you are here sitting here having hand grenades for breakfast. This is the reality. If we talk about peace, and if we want to reach some sort of settlement and stability in future of Afghanistan, we need to address this elephant in the room. How can we have so many differences in the way people are treated and how aid and money and projects are distributed? If there is so many discrepancies, how can we tap ourselves on our shoulders and say, well, we have achieved a lot and we don't want to give it up? It's simply not the truth.
It's not realistic.
No.
I mean, it's a very, very complex and tough issue to grapple with. But I think that first and foremost, I think the most important point to note is that when conflict like Afghanistan's has been going on for 4 decades, longer than any of us have been alive, is reduced to single sound bites like women's rights, we should automatically become suspicious. That's my personal view, because if there cannot be good faith in trying to reduce something so complex and so long running into something so simple. And now, secondly, I mean, like you said, we have schools, clinics, hospitals, universities, the media, everything. All of these issues that need to be resolved will obviously, if and when, let's pray that intra-Afghan negotiations do take place, if and when they do, the prospects look very vague at the moment, given that the Taliban's position has so far not been to specify their stance on anything. Their insistence has so far been that, the new system should be Islamic, and both of Afghanistan's presidents at the moment claim to be heads of Islamic governments. So exactly how the Taliban are going to add their sort of Islamic aesthetic or a deeper essence to it remains to be seen. Are they just being vague because they're genuinely open to compromise? Or are they doing it just to be deliberately vague and maximize their leverage because the situation on the ground keeps changing and no one really knows what's going to happen? Who knows? It could be strategic, or it could genuinely be them trying to be, open to compromise. But it's an issue that at this stage we can only make predictions about at best.
Thank you. I think we can wrap up this first episode. Before we finish, just final question, Emran. What is your opinion about this possible intra-Afghan dialogue? Do you have any special points to bring up about this particular issue?
Yeah, I think the intra-Afghan dialogue is really, really necessary so that Afghans, finally face each other and face each other as equals. I think it's also important and to discuss the country's future without letting other powers interfere. But I fear that we lost the momentum for this already. Maybe something happened today that might make us a bit hopeful, because according to reports, the Afghan government officials and Taliban officials in Qatar negotiated through Skype. So they met each other to talk about this prisoner deal.
Yeah.
Prisoner deal. So if that really happened, it might maybe even work as some kind of icebreaker. I don't know. Let's see. But the thing was that originally we had to have intra-Afghan talks on March 10th.
Yeah.
And it did not happen because we got these two presidents.
Yes.
And
it still makes me laugh every time I hear it.
Yeah. I mean, it should also. I mean, it's funny, but it's sad, but it's also funny, obviously, because it was always the Kabul government that said we can't talk with the Taliban because they're not a unified movement and they are splitted and whatever. And now it's Kabul itself that is splitted, and the Taliban appear to be in a united front. So and it's now easy for them. I mean, immediately after the deal was signed, Sheikh Mohammed Abbastan said that. Hey, what do you want? He said this to one reporter. He was like, hey, I'm not sure what you want because there is no legitimate government in Kabul at the moment. There are even two governments, so they can't get along with each other. What should we do there? I mean, yeah, it's an easy play for them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a problem, but I think that at the end of the day, the intra-Afghan talks are really, really necessary to decide and to talk about the future of Afghanistan. And I think everyone there, I mean, obviously, there are many war criminals and many terrible people who are part of the political landscape in Afghanistan. We have all these warlords, we have Taliban, we have the former communists, all these people. Everyone is having blood on their hands. But they will not vanish from one day to the other. So these people and the total majority, which is, which are the young people and, parts of the civil society and, different kinds of people, all of them are Afghans and they should sit and talk. Because I think there is no other way to get out of this.
Yes. Kind of depressing thought to finish on, but let's pray. Let's all make dua that inshallah peace will eventually come in Afghanistan and we will have some sort of stability and reconciliation between all warring factions, because there is one thing that we all share as a people, a nation, is that we have all been suffering for more than 40 years. And there are no parts of this society that can claim that they are the only victims. We've been all victimized, and we are also somehow, as different ethnic groups and different parts of the society, we all share the responsibility for what's happening in Afghanistan. So therefore, I am still, personally, I'm optimistic. I still believe that this intra-Afghan dialogue will somehow reach some sort of consensus about peace and stability. So inshallah this will happen, and this was our first ever recording of the AfghanEye podcast. I will be looking forward to comments and responses from our viewers and listeners. Imran, thank you very much for joining us at this very first episode. We are looking forward to seeing more of your work, your writings, and maybe you can tell us, if people want to get to know you or get in touch with you, how can they reach you?
People can reach me via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, email.
Snapchat?
Yeah. No.
TikTok?
Actually, I really have all these accounts just because of my work. Even Instagram. Instagram also appeared to be something useful to share journalistic work. So I would be happy if people reach me out. And thanks a lot for having me.
You're welcome.
Wish you all the success you need.
I will put the links to your different pages in the description box of our YouTube channel for this video, so people can reach you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it having you here with us, and we're looking forward to having you again in our podcast so we can discuss. There are so many topics, so many issues we can discuss, and hopefully in the next episode my camera will work and then you can also see my face, because you were looking at a dark picture right now.
Okay. Yeah, inshallah.
And finally, I just wanted to say that, given that this is the first AfghanEye podcast, everything we have done thus far and for the foreseeable future we are doing as freelancers. We're independently run. We're not supported by the resources of larger organizations. So we have set up a Patreon page. It's with, the first form of supporting AfghanEye would be through, feedback, comments, likes, and sharing our material. And, if you wanted to go a step further, the Patreon page is there to help us cover our expenses as an independently run platform.
And by the way, Imran, you also have a Patreon page.
Oh, yeah, Imran.
Yeah. Imran is also, Imran is a freelance journalist, and he also has a Patreon page. So guys, we will put his link also in the description box. Don't forget to support Imran as well, because he's doing excellent work as a journalist. We need to support all our talented, skilled writers and content producers and journalists, and if you can't financially support them, please share their content and make sure that you support them in a way that's more appropriate to you. Okay, thank you very much. We're wrapping this up, and we will be having another show within a week. So stay tuned. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. This podcast will eventually appear on different podcasting platforms. We're still setting things up, so stay tuned. Follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @AfgEye, so AfghanEye. And we also have a Facebook page. The link will appear in the description box of this video. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Wassalam.